She stood at the threshold of our shared apartment, suitcase by her side, the early evening light casting a golden outline around her silhouette. Eva didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply looked at me with eyes that had long since drifted elsewhere and said, "I need space. I need freedom. No drama. No long explanations. Just a few words that changed everything." I didn't chase her. I could have. For years, I would have. But something inside me, perhaps a long-dormant instinct for self-preservation, told me to stay still, to let her go. Eva and I had been together for almost 7 years. We met in our 30s when life felt like it should finally be getting simpler. It wasn't. She was spontaneous, fiery, unpredictable, everything I wasn't. I brought the calm, the stability, the patience. For a while, we made sense. I was the anchor, she was the wind. But anchors get heavy, and winds don't like being tied down. "I just need to figure out who I am outside of this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. "I feel like I've lost something. I want to find it again." I understood her. That was the worst part. I could feel her restlessness in the way she couldn't sit still anymore, the way her gaze always lingered on the horizon, on everything we hadn't done, everywhere we hadn't gone. She left on a Tuesday. It rained that night. The apartment felt larger, emptier, every sound echoing off the walls like the ghost of a life we had barely finished building. I made a cup of tea and sat in the armchair by the window, watching the streetlights shimmer through raindrops. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. Her scarf still hanging by the door. But I didn't call her. I didn't text her. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew the silence was part of the answer I needed. The days that followed were quiet, painfully so. I cleaned the apartment, not just to pass the time, but to reclaim it. I rearranged the furniture. I packed away photos. I deleted her voice from the answering machine but kept her name on the mailbox, for now. I didn't erase her completely. I wasn't angry yet. Just numb. Just trying to breathe through the void she left behind. People say the hardest part is the moment someone leaves. But it's not. It's the moments after, the first time you cook dinner for one, or wake up and forget they're not beside you. The silence between songs when you're driving. That's when it hurts. And still, I didn't reach for her. Some part of me, some quiet, growing part, knew that if I ever wanted to find peace, I had to let go completely. If she was walking away to find herself, I owed it to myself to do the same. After Eva left, there was no grand moment of reinvention. No dramatic haircut, no impulsive trip to Bali, no tearful nights shouting at the universe. There was only quiet. And in that quiet, something unexpected started to bloom, peace. Not all at once. At first, it was just the absence of arguing, the lack of walking on eggshells. The subtle relief of knowing I didn't have to anticipate her moods or chase a love that kept shifting. I began to wake up with the sun instead of staying curled under the weight of an empty bed. Morning by morning, I shaped a new rhythm. I'd make coffee, not for two but for myself, and sit on the porch just to feel the breeze brush my skin. It was such a small thing, but it grounded me. For the first time in years, my mornings weren't about managing someone else's needs. They were mine. The gym became my daily appointment. Not because I wanted to change my body to feel desirable again, but because I needed structure. I needed to prove to myself that I could commit to something and follow through, even if no one was watching. With each rep, each drop of sweat, I shed the resentment, the confusion, the question marks that Eva had left hanging in our living room like cobwebs. My work, which had once felt like a treadmill I couldn't get off, suddenly had new clarity. I poured myself into projects with purpose, not distraction. I stopped chasing promotions just to prove something. I started enjoying the challenge again. There was a satisfaction in solving problems without the emotional static that used to hum constantly in the background of my life. I was finally thinking clearly. But it wasn't just about work and routine. I began to invest in people who had always quietly stood by, friends I'd pushed to the background during the chaos of my relationship. I reconnected with my best friend, Noah, someone who had warned me gently years ago that Eva might not be someone who stayed. We started hiking again, our old tradition, and in those long treks through wooded trails and fog-kissed hills, I found moments of real laughter, unguarded, belly-deep laughter that reminded me I was still capable of joy. I also found myself rediscovering hobbies I had long since shelved. I picked up my guitar, something that had collected dust in the corner of the living room. In the evenings, I'd sit on the couch, plucking out familiar chords, letting music fill the spaces Eva used to occupy. I wasn't trying to write love songs or pour my heartbreak into lyrics. I was simply remembering who I was before I forgot. Slowly, my apartment transformed. I painted the walls. I replaced the furniture. I got rid of anything that whispered her name or reminded me of who I had been with her. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I was no longer holding space for someone who had chosen to leave. My heart healed in layers, like bark over an old wound. I stopped checking her social media. I stopped wondering if she missed me. The ache that used to wake me up at night faded, replaced by a kind of calm acceptance. Not everything needs closure. Sometimes the door closes, and that is the closure. What surprised me most was the peace. Not the kind you fight for or demand, but the kind you earn quietly by choosing yourself every day. I realized that loving someone doesn't mean you're meant to follow them when they walk away. Sometimes it means staying behind and building a life so full that their absence becomes irrelevant. I didn't hate Eva. I didn't wish her harm. I hoped, sincerely, that she found whatever it was she was looking for. But I no longer saw her as the missing piece of my puzzle. I was whole again. Maybe even more than before. In letting her go, I found myself. And in finding myself, I discovered a version of life that was calm, content, and deeply mine. It was a Saturday morning, the kind that had become routine for me, quiet, slow, and intentional. I had just come back from the farmer's market with a bag of fresh produce tucked under one arm and the calm of the morning sun resting on my shoulders. My apartment smelled like basil and fresh bread, and I was halfway through making a late breakfast when I heard the knock. 3 soft taps. Familiar, uncertain. It was the kind of knock that didn't expect to be welcomed, but hoped to be anyway. I opened the door and there she was, Eva. Her hair was longer than I remembered, less styled and more windblown. She wore a coat that didn't suit the season and clutched her purse like a child carrying a secret. For a moment, we just looked at each other. She was scanning me, eyes flitting across my face like she was searching for the man she left. But he was gone. I let her in, not out of hope, but out of closure. I was in the neighborhood, she said, her voice soft, as if volume could rewrite history. I thought maybe we could talk. I nodded once, gesturing toward the living room, and returned to the kitchen to finish slicing tomatoes. I didn't rush. I didn't change my tone. The peace I had built was not something I was about to set aside for anyone, not even her. She took in the room, her eyes landing on small details that had nothing to do with her, the new rug, the framed photos with friends she didn't know, the absence of anything shared. My world had shifted, and she looked like a ghost trying to haunt a home that no longer remembered her name. I see you've made changes, she said, and I could hear the hesitation behind her attempt at casual observation. I have, I replied evenly, setting the kettle to boil. How've you been? She hesitated. It's been different. Eye-opening. I traveled a bit, stayed with friends. I thought I'd feel free, you know. I thought space would answer all the questions. And did it? I asked, meeting her gaze. Her eyes dropped to her hands. Some. But mostly, it made me realize what I left behind. I thought maybe we could talk. Maybe we could see if. I didn't let her finish. Not out of cruelty, but because I already knew where that sentence was headed, and I didn't need to hear it to understand it. I brought 2 mugs of tea to the table and sat across from her, placing hers gently within reach. Eva, I'm glad you found what you needed. But I didn't pause my life waiting for you to come back. I didn't freeze in place hoping you'd change your mind. There was no malice in my words, just truth. And that, I think, hurt her more than any anger could have. She sipped the tea, avoiding eye contact now, her confidence unraveling with each passing moment. She had come expecting a version of me that no longer existed, the man who once would have bent himself into knots to keep her from leaving, the one who stayed up wondering what he could have done differently. But I wasn't that man anymore. I didn't expect it to be the same, she whispered, almost to herself. But I thought maybe. You thought you could come back and pick up where we left off, I said gently. But that place doesn't exist anymore. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time since she arrived, she looked small. Not because she had lost anything, but because I had gained everything, and she could feel the weight of it in the space between us. I never wanted to hurt you, she said. I know, I replied. But you still did. There was a long silence, the kind that carries more than words. She stared at the floor, and I watched her, not with love, not even with longing, but with a sense of finality. She had made her choice. And I had built a life in the quiet aftermath of it, one that didn't include her anymore. Eventually, she stood. I should go. I walked her to the door, the way you do with someone who once meant everything and now only represents a closed chapter. She paused before stepping out, her hand resting on the doorframe. I'm happy for you, she said softly. You seem different. Stronger. I am, I replied. I found peace. And once you have it, you protect it. She nodded, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. Regret, maybe. Loss. But she didn't ask to stay. She didn't cry or beg. She just left. I closed the door behind her with the quiet click of finality, turned back toward my apartment, and breathed. There was no shaking, no unraveling. Just stillness. I sat back down at the table, finished my tea, and reached for my book. My day continued. Unshaken. Unchanged. And that's when I knew, she hadn't returned to my life. She had only passed through it. In the days that followed Eva's visit, I expected some sort of emotional aftershock. I waited for the old ache to resurface, the pangs of nostalgia to find their way into my chest again. But they never did. What came instead was an unmistakable sense of affirmation, a quiet, steady voice within me that simply said, "You're okay. You've moved on." Eva didn't call. She didn't text. She vanished again, this time into the silence that felt earned, like the final page of a long and painful chapter. There was no drama, no drawn-out goodbye. And strangely, that made the closure even more complete. She had walked out once in search of herself. She walked back in, hoping to be a part of something that no longer needed her. And when she saw it, she left again, but this time, she knew she wasn't needed. That, I think, was her realization. But mine came slowly, in fragments. It happened on a Wednesday evening, when I was reorganizing my bookshelf and came across an old journal I had kept during the early days after her departure. I flipped through the pages and found lines soaked in confusion, in self-blame, in desperate questions about what I lacked. As I read those entries, I hardly recognized the man behind the words. He was hurting, yes, but more than that, he was waiting. Waiting to be chosen. Waiting to be wanted again. I put the journal down and smiled, not in arrogance, but in recognition. I had grown beyond that man. He had been a necessary version of me, but not a permanent one. Later that same week, I found myself at a dinner party a friend had invited me to. Nothing formal, just a dozen people, some old faces, some new. I ended up seated next to a woman named Claire, a teacher who spoke with conviction and curiosity. She didn't know about my past, and she didn't ask. She only spoke about books, music, and hiking trails she'd discovered. Her energy was calm but present, nothing like Eva's, and that contrast was like a lighthouse cutting through fog. I didn't compare them consciously, but the differences illuminated something important. I no longer found chaos charming. I wasn't drawn to people who mistook emotional turbulence for passion. What I craved now was stability, not monotony, but balance. A life that didn't feel like walking on a tightrope every day. Claire and I talked until the wine ran out and the room had grown quiet. She left me with her number scribbled on a napkin, not because there was a spark, but because there was space for one. And I realized then that I wasn't guarding my peace out of fear anymore. I was simply protecting what I had created. That weekend, Eva showed up once more, not in person, but as a message. She had sent me a photo of the lake near our old vacation spot, followed by a short line, "Remember this place?" There was no follow-up, no plea, no invitation. Just a breadcrumb, a piece of shared memory dropped like a lure. I stared at the screen for a moment and then set the phone down without responding. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel tempted. I just didn't feel the pull anymore. That was the final shift, the moment I knew, truly and finally, that the part of me who had once waited for her return was gone. And with his absence came the understanding that Eva had never been the missing piece. She had been a lesson. Her leaving forced me to rebuild, to reevaluate, to grow into the man I had become. Her return had shown me the full arc of that growth. She hadn't come back to rekindle anything, she had come back to see if the door was still open. And I had shown her that it wasn't, not because I had locked it out of bitterness, but because I had moved into another house entirely. Eva wasn't the villain in my story. She was simply someone on her own path, a path that veered away from mine long before either of us had the courage to say it aloud. But in seeking her freedom, she helped me find my own. And I would always be grateful for that. I took a long walk that evening, through the park where Eva and I used to sit on quiet Sundays. The bench was still there, worn and weathered. I sat down for a few minutes, not to mourn, but to honor the man I had once been, the one who had loved deeply, hurt quietly, and then, piece by piece, chosen to rise. I thought about the peace I'd found. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that follows forgiveness, of her, of myself, of all the ways things could have gone differently. I no longer needed explanations. I didn't need her to understand what she'd missed. I had nothing to prove and nothing to reclaim. She walked away to find herself. I stayed and found my life. And that life had become so rich, so deeply fulfilling, that even her return hadn't disturbed the stillness I had worked so hard to build. Life didn't change after Eva's final message. That was the surprising part. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden swell of closure or vindication. Instead, everything continued, quietly, steadily, just as it had been before. My days moved forward like pages in a well-paced novel, each one building on the last, not toward anything spectacular, but toward something far more valuable: consistency. In the months that followed, I noticed something subtle but powerful about the way I carried myself. My conversations with friends were lighter, more present. I no longer brought Eva up in passing stories. She no longer lingered in the pauses between thoughts or in the background of my memories. It was as if my mind had quietly reorganized itself, placing her into a chapter that no longer needed revisiting. She was a part of my story, yes, but not the defining part. Not anymore. The apartment felt more like home than ever. Every corner bore my imprint, photos I had chosen, books I had read, the scent of the candles I lit every evening. What once felt like an echo chamber of shared history had transformed into a sanctuary of solitude and self-awareness. There were no ghosts here, only evidence of a man who had found his way forward. Sometimes I'd run into people who still asked about her, mutual friends who hadn't heard the full story or who were hesitant to pry. I always responded with the same honesty: she's doing her thing, and I'm doing mine. There was no bitterness, no need to unpack the past for the sake of sympathy. What had happened between us was no longer an open wound. It was a healed scar, visible, but no longer sensitive. Claire and I started seeing more of each other. It was slow, intentional, without pressure or expectation. We met for coffee on quiet afternoons and shared long walks where conversation flowed effortlessly, unburdened by any need to impress or perform. With her, there was no dramatic rush, no fireworks demanding attention. Just warmth. Just comfort. Just peace. What I appreciated most about Claire was her ability to meet me where I was. She wasn't trying to fill a role or repair something broken. She simply saw me as I was, and I saw her the same way, two people who had known enough life to appreciate simplicity, honesty, and calm. There was something quietly powerful about being with someone who had no need to rescue or be rescued. One evening, as we sat together on my balcony, watching the city lights shimmer against the twilight sky, I realized that this life I had built, was never about proving something to Eva or to anyone else. It was about honoring myself. I had chosen peace not as a reaction to chaos, but as a foundation for everything I wanted from here on out. And in doing so, I had created a life that was no longer vulnerable to the comings and goings of those who didn't know how to stay. Eva never reached out again. I never expected her to. She had returned once, perhaps hoping for comfort, maybe even redemption. But she had seen what I had become, rooted, steady, fulfilled. And in that realization, she must have known what I had already accepted: there was no place for her here. The aftermath of it all wasn't destruction or loss. It was clarity. It was the quiet joy of moving through each day without waiting for anything or anyone to complete me. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of ending, the one where you don't need a dramatic finale, because you've already found your beginning. I had been left. I had stayed. And in staying, I had discovered a life so full, so calm, and so wholly mine that not even her return could shake it. And that was enough.